Sometimes life breaks us so completely that we forget what it feels like to be whole again. Sometimes we carry our loneliness so long that we believe it's all we deserve. In Red Hollow, two broken souls are about to discover that healing doesn't always come gentle. Silas Wade is a giant of a man, scarred by war and hardened by years of fighting. Miss Lillian Grace is a widowed teacher who came west to escape her past, but found only cold shoulders and cruel whispers. When danger threatens the town, Silas steps out of the shadows he's lived in for years. He walks into her classroom, removes his hat, and speaks words that will change everything. There's no room for games on the frontier, only truth. His truth is simple. He's claiming her heart tonight. What happens when a man who's forgotten how to be gentle meets a woman who's forgotten how to trust? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Red Hollow, painting the weathered storefronts in shades of amber and gold. It was the kind of light that made even the harshest frontier town look almost beautiful. Though beauty was a luxury, most folks here couldn't afford to notice. They were too busy surviving. Miss Lillian Grace stood at the window of the one-room schoolhouse, watching the town wake up with the slow, deliberate pace of people who had learned not to waste energy on hurried movements. Her fingers traced the worn leather cover of her late husband's Bible, the artifact she carried everywhere, a tattered reminder of faith tested by loss and loneliness. The pages had grown soft from countless readings, especially the passages about comfort in times of sorrow. At 28, Lillian had already lived more grief than some folks see in a lifetime. The war had taken her husband Thomas before they'd celebrated their second wedding anniversary, leaving her with nothing but memories and a small inheritance that had brought her west to this unforgiving place. She'd hoped distance might dull the ache in her chest, but some wounds travel with you no matter how far you run. The schoolhouse door creaked as young Billy Harmon pushed it open, his freckled face already streaked with dust from the walk across town. At 8 years old, he was one of her most eager students, though his enthusiasm was often tempered by the harsh realities of frontier life that aged children too quickly. "Morning, Miss Grace," he said, setting his worn primer on the desk nearest the window. "Ma says the new reverend's coming through next week, says maybe you'll finally have someone proper to talk to." Lillian smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. The townspeople meant well, mostly, but their idea of proper conversation usually involved gentle suggestions that she find herself a husband and stop filling children's heads with too much book learning. They saw her education as something suspicious, her independence as unnatural for a woman her age. "Your mother is very thoughtful, Billy," she said, arranging the day's lessons on her desk. "But I find plenty of good conversation right here with all of you." The boy grinned and took his seat as other children began filtering in. There was Sarah, the mayor's daughter, whose crisp dresses and careful manners set her apart from the other children. Little Tom Martinez, whose father worked the silver mine and spoke more Spanish than English at home. And quiet, Emma, whose mother had died in childbirth the previous winter, leaving her to help raise 3 younger siblings. Each child carried stories that would have broken softer hearts, but Lillian had learned to see their resilience rather than their hardships. They were growing up fast in this hard country, but she was determined to give them something beyond mere survival knowledge, hope, perhaps even dreams of worlds beyond Red Hollow's dusty streets. As the children settled into their morning routine, Lillian's gaze drifted beyond them to the vast landscape visible through the schoolhouse windows. The terrain rolled endlessly toward distant mountains, painted in shades of brown and gold that shifted with the moving clouds. It was beautiful in its harsh way, but also isolating. The nearest real town was a 2-day ride, and sometimes Lillian felt as though she were teaching at the edge of the world. She'd been in Red Hollow for 8 months now, long enough to understand its rhythms and recognize its characters. There was Mayor Cartwright, a well-meaning man who worried constantly about the town's reputation and growth. His wife, Eleanor, who organized the ladies' social circle and kept careful track of everyone's business with the dedication of a court clerk. Dr. Benjamin Hayes, whose gentle manner and genuine kindness had made him one of the few people Lillian considered a true friend. Then there was Jack Morrison, who owned the Lucky Dollar Saloon and treated everyone with equal measures of gruff affection and suspicion. The blacksmith, Old Pete, whose stories of the territory's early days could keep folks entertained for hours. And Martha Williams, who ran the general store and seemed to know everything that happened within 50 miles of Red Hollow. But it was the man she rarely saw who occupied far too many of her thoughts. Silas Wade. Even thinking his name sent an odd flutter through her chest that she tried desperately to ignore. She'd heard the stories, of course everyone in Red Hollow had. How he'd served in the war, fighting in battles whose names were spoken in hushed tones. How he'd returned to find his family's ranch in ruins and had rebuilt it through sheer determination and back-breaking work. How he lived alone now, coming to town only when necessary, speaking to few and trusting fewer. She'd seen him perhaps a dozen times since arriving in Red Hollow, always from a distance. He was exactly as people described, tall enough to make other men look small, broad-shouldered, in a way that spoke of physical labor and hardship. His dark hair was usually hidden beneath a worn hat, but she'd caught glimpses of grey at his temples that suggested he was older than his strong frame indicated. Perhaps 35, maybe more. What struck her most were his eyes. Even from across the street, she could feel the weight of his gaze when it settled on something. There was intelligence there, and pain, and something else she couldn't quite name, a watchfulness that suggested he saw everything and forgot nothing. The children had whispered stories about him too, the way children do when they sense adult mysteries they don't quite understand. They said he could track a man across solid rock, that he never missed with his rifle, that he'd killed more men than anyone in the territory. But they also said he'd once carried an injured horse 3 miles to save its life, and that he'd quietly paid Dr. Hayes to tend to the Martinez family when little Tom's father was injured in the mine. Lillian tried not to think about him, but it was difficult when his ranch lay along the route between town and the small cabin she rented from the Harrisons. Sometimes, when the wind was right, she could hear the sound of his work, the ring of hammer on metal, the lowing of cattle, the occasional bark of his dog. Normal sounds that somehow seemed charged with meaning when she knew they came from his direction. She'd caught him watching her twice. Once, when she was walking home from the general store with her arms full of supplies, she'd looked up to see him sitting motionless on his horse at the crest of a nearby hill. He'd been too far away to read his expression, but something in his stillness had made her heart race. The second time, she'd been hanging laundry behind her cabin when she'd noticed him riding slowly along the ridge that overlooked her small valley. Again, that perfect stillness, as though he were carved from the landscape itself. Both times, she'd felt a strange mix of fear and something else, something that made her cheeks warm and her hands tremble slightly as she went about her tasks. She told herself it was simply the natural nervousness any woman would feel being observed by a man with his reputation. But late at night, when sleep eluded her and the coyotes sang in the distance, she sometimes wondered if there might be more to it than that. The town's opinion of Silas Wade was complicated, like most things in Red Hollow. They respected his strength and his ability to handle trouble, but they also kept their distance. Men nodded to him respectfully when he came to town, but few attempted actual conversation. Women watched him with a mixture of admiration and wariness, though Lillian had noticed more than one unmarried lady attempting to catch his attention over the years. He never seemed to notice their efforts, or if he did, he gave no sign of it. "Miss Grace," Sarah's voice brought Lillian back to the present. "Are you feeling poorly? You look flushed." Lillian touched her cheek and realized she'd been wool-gathering again, lost in thoughts that had no business occupying a schoolteacher's mind during lesson time. The children were all watching her with the keen attention they usually reserved for particularly interesting stories. "I'm fine, dear," she said, moving to the blackboard with determined efficiency. "Now, let's begin with our arithmetic. "Billy, can you tell me what 7 times 8 equals?" The morning passed in the familiar rhythm of lessons and recitations. Lillian found comfort in the routine, in the children's eager faces and earnest questions. This was her purpose now, her contribution to this hard land and harder people. She was giving these children tools they would need to build better lives, whether they stayed in Red Hollow or ventured into the wider world. But even as she guided them through their letters and numbers, part of her mind remained fixed on the mystery of Silas Wade. She'd heard that his father's silver pocket watch had stopped at the exact moment the old man died, defending their ranch from raiders years ago. The story might have been just talk, but something about it resonated with her. Time stopping at moments of great loss, she understood that feeling all too well. As the afternoon wore on and the children prepared to leave for the day, Lillian gathered her things and prepared for the walk home. She always stayed a bit longer than necessary, partly to prepare lessons for the next day, and partly because the empty cabin that awaited her felt especially lonely in the hours just before sunset. "Have a good evening, Miss Grace," Emma said shyly as she collected her slate and primer. "Ma says to tell you she appreciated the soup you brought by yesterday." "You're very welcome, dear," Lillian replied, touched by the gesture. Small kindnesses like this were what made Red Hollow bearable, what reminded her that beneath the town's rough exterior were people trying their best to care for each other. As the last child disappeared down the dusty street, Lillian locked the schoolhouse and began her own journey home. The afternoon light was already beginning to change, taking on the golden quality that preceded the spectacular sunsets this country was known for. She walked slowly, savoring the brief coolness that came with evening and the peaceful quiet that settled over the town as day shifted toward night. Her cabin sat in a small valley about a mile from Red Hollow's main street, close enough to walk to work, but far enough to provide a sense of privacy. It wasn't much: 2 rooms, a small porch, and a yard just large enough for a vegetable garden, but it was hers, and that meant something. As she crested the small rise that led down to her valley, Lillian paused to watch the sun sink toward the mountains. The sky was beginning to paint itself in shades of orange and pink, and somewhere in the distance a meadowlark offered its liquid song to the coming evening. For a moment, standing there with Thomas's Bible clutched in her hands and the vast landscape spread before her, she felt something approaching peace. Then she saw the horse and rider silhouetted against the sunset, motionless on the ridge that overlooked her cabin. Even at this distance, even with the light behind him making details impossible to discern, she knew it was Silas Wade. Something in the set of his shoulders, the way he sat his horse with unconscious grace, the patient stillness that seemed to be his natural state. Her heart began to beat faster, though she couldn't say if it was from fear or something else entirely. He was too far away to be threatening, and something in his posture suggested watchfulness rather than menace. But why was he there? What was he watching for? As if sensing her attention, the distant figure turned slightly in her direction. Even across the space that separated them, Lillian felt the weight of his gaze settling on her like a physical thing. For a long moment, they remained frozen in this strange Tablothe schoolteacher and the mysterious rancher, separated by distance but connected by something neither of them fully understood. Then, with the same deliberate grace with which he did everything, Silas Wade touched the brim of his hat in what might have been a greeting, turned his horse, and disappeared into the gathering shadows. Lillian stood there for several more minutes, staring at the empty ridge and trying to understand what had just passed between them. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she realized she was holding her breath. When she finally exhaled, it came out in a long, shaky sigh that seemed to carry more than just air. Whatever was happening between her and the enigmatic rancher, it was bigger than simple curiosity. And as she made her way down to her cabin with darkness settling around her like a familiar blanket, Lillian found herself wondering if she was ready for whatever was coming. The wind picked up as she reached her door, carrying with it the scents of sage and distant rain. Somewhere in that wind, she could swear she heard the echo of her own loneliness calling back to her, but for the first time since arriving in Red Hollow, it didn't sound quite so hopeless. Change was coming to their small corner of the frontier. She could feel it in the air, in the weight of that distant gaze, in the way her heart had started beating to a rhythm she'd almost forgotten. Whether that change would bring healing or heartbreak remained to be seen. The threatening letter lay on Lillian's desk like a coiled snake, its crude handwriting spelling out words that made her stomach turn cold. She'd found it that morning, tucked between the pages of her arithmetic primer, waiting for her like a poisoned gift. Teachers who don't know their place don't last long in Red Hollow, the note read in scratchy, barely legible letters. Stop filling our children's heads with fancy ideas. Stop acting like you're better than decent folk. Leave town or learn what happens to women who forget where they belong. It wasn't signed, but the paper was cheap and the ink was the kind sold at Morrison's general store. Someone in Red Hollow, someone she saw regularly, perhaps even smiled at on the street, had taken the time to write these hateful words and sneak them into her classroom. Lillian's hands shook as she read the message for the third time, though she'd already memorized every cruel word. This wasn't the first sign of the town's growing hostility toward her, but it was by far the most direct. The whispers had been building for weeks, ever since she'd started teaching the children about places beyond Red Hollow, about books and ideas and possibilities that extended past cattle ranching and mining. She'd thought she was giving them hope. Apparently, some folks saw it as something far more dangerous. The morning sun streamed through the schoolhouse windows, casting long rectangles of light across the wooden floor, but the warmth couldn't touch the chill that had settled deep in her bones. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her reticule, though touching it made her skin crawl. She needed to think, to decide what to do, but her mind felt clouded with fear and hurt. The children would arrive soon, their faces bright with the anticipation of learning, and she would have to smile and teach and pretend that her world hadn't just shifted on its axis. She would have to look at their parents during the church social on Sunday and wonder which of them had written those words, which of them wanted her gone badly enough to resort to threats. Billy Harmon was the first to arrive, as usual, his cheerful greeting cutting through her dark thoughts like sunshine through storm clouds. "Morning, Miss Grace. Ma packed me extra biscuits. Said you looked too thin last time she saw you." Lillian managed a smile, though it felt brittle on her lips. "That's very kind of your mother, Billy. Save one for later, we have a long day ahead of us." More children trickled in, each one carrying their slate and primer, each one representing a small flame of hope in this hard country. Sarah Cartwright arrived with her hair in perfect braids, followed by the Martinez children with dust on their shoes from the long walk from the mining camp. Emma came last, as always, having helped get her younger siblings ready before making her own way to school. As Lillian watched them settle into their routine, she felt her resolve beginning to strengthen. These children needed her, needed what she could give them. She wouldn't be driven away by anonymous threats from people too cowardly to face her directly. But as the morning wore on, she couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching her from every direction. When she stepped outside during the noon break, she noticed how conversations stopped when she approached, how people turned away rather than meet her gaze. The invisible walls that had always existed around her seemed to be growing higher and thicker with each passing day. It was Martha Williams from the general store who finally spoke the words that everyone else was thinking. "Miss Grace," she called out as Lillian walked past on her way back from posting a letter at the territorial office. "Might I have a word?" Martha was a solid woman in her 50s, with grey hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She'd always been polite to Lillian, if not exactly warm, but now there was something harder in her expression. "Of course, Mrs. Williams. I've been hearing talk," Martha said without preamble, "about the things you're teaching those children, about how you're filling their heads with ideas about leaving Red Hollow, about how they're too good for the life their parents have built here." Lillian felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I teach them reading, writing, and arithmetic, Mrs. Williams. The same curriculum approved by the Territorial Education Board." "Maybe so, but it's not what you teach. It's how you teach it, making them think they need to go to big cities to make something of themselves, making them ashamed of honest work and simple lives." I would never. Wouldn't you? Martha's voice grew sharper. My nephew Bobby came home last week talking about how Miss Grace says there are libraries in Denver with more books than a person could read in a lifetime. How there are schools back east where people study nothing but poetry and music. You think that's fitting conversation for a boy whose father died in the mine and whose mother takes in washing to keep food on the table? The accusation hit Lillian like a physical blow. She'd mentioned those things, yes, but only to expand the children's understanding of the world, to help them see possibilities beyond the narrow confines of their daily existence. She'd never meant to make them ashamed of their families or their lives. Mrs. Williams, save it, Martha said, turning away. Just remember that Red Hollow was here long before you came, and it'll be here long after you're gone. Don't make things harder than they need to be. Lillian stood frozen on the wooden sidewalk, watching Martha's retreating figure and feeling the weight of every curious glance from passers-by. The message was clear. She was an outsider, a disruptor, someone who didn't belong and never would. That evening, as she walked home through the gathering dusk, Lillian felt more alone than she had since arriving in Red Hollow. The threatening letter seemed to burn in her reticule, and every shadow looked like it might be hiding someone who wished her harm. The vast landscape that had once seemed beautiful now felt isolating and hostile. She was so lost in her troubled thoughts that she almost didn't notice the rider approaching from the direction of her cabin until he was close enough for her to see his face clearly in the fading light. Silas Wade. He rode toward her with the same unhurried grace she'd observed from a distance, but now, with him actually approaching, Lillian felt her heart begin to race. Up close, he was even more imposing than she'd imagined, easily 6.5 feet tall, even sitting in the saddle, with shoulders that strained the fabric of his worn shirt and hands that looked like they could break a man's neck without much effort. But it was his face that caught and held her attention. It was a weathered face, marked by sun and wind and years of hard living, with deep lines around eyes that were the color of storm clouds. There was grey in his dark hair, as she'd suspected, and a scar that ran from his left temple down to his Jawa souvenir from some long-ago violence. He pulled his horse to a stop about 10 feet away from her, close enough to speak, but far enough to avoid seeming threatening. When he touched the brim of his hat in greeting, the gesture was almost courtly despite his rough appearance. "Miss Grace," he said, and his voice was exactly what she'd expected, deep and rough, like distant thunder rolling across the plains. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion." Lillian found her voice, though it came out softer than she'd intended. "Mr. Wade, it sits quite all right." He studied her face for a long moment, those storm-grey eyes missing nothing. When he spoke again, there was something gentle in his tone that seemed almost at odds with his intimidating presence. "I couldn't help but notice you seemed troubled this evening. I hope nothing's wrong." The simple kindness in his voice nearly undid her. All day she'd been holding back tears, maintaining her composure in the face of hostility and rejection. But something about this unexpected concern from a man she barely knew made her defenses crumble. She began, then stopped, pressing her lips together to keep them from trembling. "It's been a difficult day." Silas nodded slowly, as if he understood more than she'd said. "This country can be hard on people who don't fit the mold others expect them to fill." The observation was so accurate, so precisely what she'd been feeling, that Lillian looked up at him in surprise. In the fading light, his scarred face seemed almost kind, and she realized that beneath the intimidating exterior was a man who understood something about being an outsider. "I try to fit in," she said quietly. "I try to be what they want me to be, but it never seems to be enough." "Maybe the problem isn't with what you're trying to be," Silas said. "Maybe it's that you're trying to be something you're not." Before Lillian could respond to this unexpected wisdom, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both turn. 3 riders were coming toward them from the direction of town, moving fast enough to kick up clouds of dust in the still evening air. Silas's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The gentle concern vanished, replaced by the alert stillness of a predator sensing danger. His hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the gun at his hip, and his horse shifted restlessly beneath him, as if picking up on its rider's sudden tension. "Get behind me," he said quietly, but there was steel in his voice that brooked no argument. "What? Now, Lillian." The use of her first name sent a shock through her, but the urgency in his tone cut through her surprise. She moved quickly to put his horse between herself and the approaching riders, her heart hammering against her ribs. The three men pulled up in a cloud of dust and jingling spurs. Lillian didn't recognize them, but something about their hard faces and the casual way they wore their guns told her they weren't local ranchers or miners. These were men who lived by violence, and the way they looked at Silas suggested they knew exactly who he was. "Well, well," said the man in the center, a lean figure with a scraggly beard and eyes like chips of flint. "If it isn't the famous Silas Wade, heard you were hiding out in this God-forsaken country." "Johnson," Silas replied, his voice flat and emotionless. "Thought you were smart enough to stay in Mexico after what happened in Abilene." Johnson's laugh was ugly. "Mexico got too hot thanks to you. Figured it was time to settle some old debts." Lillian pressed herself closer to Silas's horse, trying to understand what was happening while fighting down the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. These men had come looking for Silas specifically, which meant this confrontation was about his past, not random trouble. "The lady has nothing to do with this," Silas said, and there was a warning in his voice that made the hair on Lillian's arms stand up. "Let her pass." "Oh, but she does now," Johnson said, his grin revealing yellowed teeth. "See, we heard you've taken a shine to the pretty schoolteacher. Makes her valuable, don't it?" In that moment, Lillian understood with crystalline clarity that her world had just changed forever. The threatening letter, the town's hostility, her lonely struggle to find her place in Red Hollow, all of it paled beside the immediate danger these men represented. But more than that, she realized that Silas Wade, the mysterious rancher who had watched her from afar, had just claimed her as his responsibility. And something in the way he sat his horse, in the deadly calm that radiated from him like heat from a forge, told her that he was prepared to kill or die to protect her. The evening that had begun with anonymous threats and small-town cruelty had become something far more dangerous. And as the three men spread out to surround them, Lillian found herself trusting her life to a man she barely knew, whose past was clearly violent, and whose intentions toward her remained a mystery. The only thing she knew for certain was that there would be no going back to the quiet, lonely life she'd been trying so hard to build in Red Hollow. The tension stretched like a bowstring for what felt like hours, but could only have been seconds. Lillian could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears as the three men positioned themselves around her and Silas, their hands resting casually on their gun handles with the practiced ease of men who had killed before. Then Silas spoke, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Johnson, you've got about 10 seconds to decide whether you want to ride away from this or get planted in Red Hollow soil. Either way suits me fine." Johnson's laugh was harsh. Big talk for a man who's outnumbered 3-1. "You're counting wrong," Silas said, and something in his tone made Lillian's skin prickle. "There's only one of me, but there's also only one of you that matters. Your boys, they're a hired muscle they'll run when you drop. Question is, are you fast enough to clear leather before I put a bullet through your heart?" The casual certainty in his voice was more frightening than any threat Lillian had ever heard. This wasn't bravado or bluffing. This was a man stating simple facts about violence and death with the same tone he might use to discuss the weather. For a moment, the tableau held three killers facing one man and a schoolteacher in the fading light of evening. Then Johnson's nerve broke, just slightly, just enough for doubt to creep into his eyes. "This ain't over, Wade," he snarled, but he was already pulling his horse back a step. "Not by a long shot." "It is for tonight," Silas replied, "and if I see you within 10 miles of Miss Grace again, it'll be over permanent." Johnson spat in the dust and wheeled his horse around, his companions following after a moment's hesitation. They rode hard toward the hills, their departure marked by a cloud of dust and the fading sound of hoofbeats. Lillian realized she'd been holding her breath and let it out in a long, shaky exhale. Her knees felt weak, and she had to grip Silas's stirrup to keep from swaying. "Are you hurt?" His voice had lost its deadly edge, returning to the gentle concern he'd shown earlier. "No, I don't think so." She looked up at him, seeing his face clearly for the first time since the confrontation began. The harsh lines were still there, the scar still marked his jaw. But there was something different in his expression now, something almost tender. "Those men," she said, finding her voice stronger than she'd expected, "they knew you, from before." Silas nodded slowly, his storm-grey eyes studying her face, as if trying to gauge her reaction. "I've made enemies, Miss Grace, more than I care to count. I'd hoped that part of my life was behind me, but apparently some debts follow a man no matter how far he runs." "What kind of debts?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of old pain and older regrets. The kind that get paid in blood. Lillian should have been frightened by this admission, should have backed away from this man who spoke so casually of violence and death. Instead, she found herself stepping closer to his horse, drawn by something she couldn't name. "Why did you help me?" she asked. "Because you needed help," he said simply. "And because no woman should have to face men like that alone." There was something in his voice, a gentleness that seemed almost out of place coming from such a hard man. As if sensing her thoughts, Silas swung down from his saddle with fluid grace, bringing himself to eye level with her. Even standing on the ground, he towered over her, but somehow his presence felt protective rather than threatening. "Miss Grace Lillian," he said, and the sound of her name on his lips sent warmth spreading through her chest. "I need you to understand something. Those men will be back, and when they come, they won't be interested in fair fights or honor. They'll use whatever they think will hurt me most." "And they think she began, then stopped as the implication hit her. "They think you care about me." "Don't you know?" he asked softly. "Haven't you felt me watching over you these past months?" The admission hung in the air between them like something fragile and precious. Lillian's heart began to race again, but this time it wasn't from fear. "I felt something," she whispered, "but I thought I didn't dare hope." "Hope for what?" She looked up into his scarred face, seeing not the dangerous man who had just faced down 3 killers, but someone who had been as lonely as she was. Someone who understood what it meant to carry pain and try to build something new from the pieces of what remained. "That someone might see me," she said, "really see me, not just the proper school teacher or the lonely widow, but me." Silas reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and touched her cheek with fingers that were surprisingly gentle, despite their obvious strength. "I see you, Lillian Grace. I've been seeing you since the day you arrived in Red Hollow, walking down that dusty street with your chin up and your spine straight, pretending you weren't afraid of starting over in a place that didn't want you." His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, and Lillian felt herself leaning into the touch, despite every voice in her head telling her this was madness. "I've been whittling," he said, and there was almost shyness in his admission. "Little things, mostly. Helps me think." From his shirt pocket, he withdrew something small and delicate wooden rose, carved from what looked like cherry wood and polished smooth. Every petal was perfectly formed, every detail lovingly crafted by hands that knew both creation and destruction. "I made this for you," he said, pressing it into her palm. "Been carrying it for weeks, trying to work up the courage to give it to you proper." Lillian stared down at the wooden rose, feeling tears prick at her eyes. It was beautiful in its simplicity, but more than that, it represented hours of work, of thought, of a man thinking about her while his hands shaped something lovely from raw wood. "It's beautiful," she whispered, "but Silas, I don't understand. You don't really know me." "I know enough," he said. "I know you're brave enough to come west alone after losing your husband. I know you're kind enough to bring soup to families who need it. I know you're strong enough to stand up to a town that wants to break you down. And I know you have the most beautiful smile I've ever seen, even though you don't use it nearly enough." The tears spilled over then, rolling down her cheeks as months of loneliness and fear finally found their release. "I'm so tired of being alone," she said. "So tired of pretending that I'm fine, that I don't need anyone." "You're not alone anymore," Silas said, and there was such certainty in his voice that she almost believed him. "Not if you don't want to be. But those men, we'll find out what happens when they threaten something I care about." He finished, and the steel was back in his voice. "I won't let them hurt you, Lillian. I give you my word on that." Looking up into his face, seeing the determination there, and something deeper, something that looked almost like love, Lillian made a decision that would have terrified her that morning. She stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his large frame, close enough to smell the scents of leather and wood smoke that clung to his clothes. "What are you asking of me?" she said. "Nothing you're not ready to give," he replied. "But I'm hoping you might be willing to let me court you proper. Let me show you that not all men are cruel, that some of us remember how to be gentle with precious things. The town will talk. Let them talk. They've been talking about both of us already, might as well give them something worth discussing." Despite everything, the threats, the danger, the uncertainty of what tomorrow might bring, Lillian found herself smiling. It was a real smile, the kind Silas had said she didn't use enough, and she saw the way his eyes lightened when he saw it. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like that very much." Silas smiled back, and the expression transformed his harsh features completely. For just a moment, she could see the man he might have been, if life had been kinder, if war and violence hadn't carved such deep marks in his soul. "Then let me start by seeing you safely home," he said, offering her his arm with old-fashioned courtesy. "The least a suitor can do is make sure his lady doesn't have to walk alone in the dark." As they made their way toward her cabin, Silas leading his horse and Lillian's hand tucked securely in the crook of his arm, she felt something she hadn't experienced in monthshope. The wooden rose was warm in her palm, a tangible reminder that someone saw her worth, that someone thought she was worth the effort of creation. Behind them, the last light faded from the western sky, and ahead lay whatever tomorrow might bring. But for the first time since arriving in Red Hollow, Lillian wasn't afraid of the darkness. The blue silk ribbon lay in Lillian's dresser drawer like a fragment of her former life, catching the morning light that filtered through her cabin windows. She held it between her fingers, remembering how Thomas had bought it for her in St. Louis during their brief courtship, how he'd said it matched her eyes and made her look like a princess from a fairy tale. For 2 long years, she'd worn black. 2 years of mourning dress and severe hairstyles, of presenting herself to the world as a woman defined entirely by loss. The blue ribbon had remained hidden away, too bright and hopeful for the grief that had become her identity. But this morning, 3 days after Silas Wade had walked her home and spoken of courtship with gentle certainty, Lillian found herself considering the ribbon with new eyes. She thought of his words about letting him show her that some men remembered how to be gentle with precious things, and wondered if it might be time to remember that she was more than just a widow trying to survive in a hostile world. The wooden rose sat on her bedside table, its polished surface glowing warm in the morning sun. She'd placed it there so it would be the first thing she saw each morning and the last thing each night, a reminder that someone found her worthy of such careful craftsmanship, such thoughtful attention. A soft knock at her cabin door interrupted her contemplation. When she opened it, she found Silas standing on her small porch, hat in hand, and an expression on his scarred face that was both hopeful and uncertain. "Miss Grace," he said, then caught himself. "Lillian, I hope I'm not calling too early." "Not at all," she replied, acutely aware that her hair was still in its nighttime braid and her dress was the simple grey cotton she wore for household chores. "Would you like some coffee? I was just about to make breakfast." "That would be kind of you if it's no trouble." She gestured him inside, watching as he had to duck slightly to clear the doorframe. Her cabin, which had always seemed adequate, if modest, suddenly felt tiny with his large frame filling the space. But there was something wonderful about having another person here, about breaking the silence that had been her only companion for so many months. "I brought something," Silas said as she busied herself with the coffee pot. From his saddlebags, he withdrew a cloth-wrapped package that smelled of fresh bread and something sweet. "Mrs. Henderson at the ranch has been after me to find someone to share her cooking with. Says a man living alone is an insult to good food." Lillian couldn't help but smile at this. "Mrs. Henderson is your housekeeper?" "More like the woman who keeps me from starving to death and occasionally prevents me from making a complete fool of myself," Silas said, and there was real affection in his voice. "She's been with our family since before my father died, raised me as much as my mother did, truth be told." As they sat at her small table sharing warm biscuits and honey, Lillian found herself studying his face in the morning light. The scar that ran from temple to jaw was more pronounced than she'd realized. A jagged line that spoke of violence survived rather than avoided. But his eyes, those storm-grey eyes, held none of the hardness she might have expected from a man with his reputation. "May I ask how you got that?" she said, then immediately flushed. "I'm sorry, that was presumptuous of me." "No," Silas said, touching the scar unconsciously. "If we're to know each other proper, you have a right to ask." He was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee cup as if seeking the right words there. "It was during the war," he said finally. "Battle of Antietam. Confederate saber caught me when I was trying to help a wounded friend to safety. The man who gave it to me was younger than I was, probably as scared as I was. I killed him 30 seconds later." The simple, matter-of-fact way he said it sent a chill through Lillian. This wasn't bravado or boasting, this was a man stating a truth that had shaped him, that lived with him every day. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. "I regret the war," Silas said. "I regret that boys barely old enough to shave had to die for causes they barely understood. But do I regret defending myself and trying to save my friend? No. Some things a man does because he must, not because he wants to." Lillian nodded, recognizing something of her own philosophy in his words. Sometimes life gave you impossible choices, and all you could do was make the best decision you could with the information you had. "What happened to your friend?" she asked. For the first time since he'd started talking, Silas smiled. "He lived, runs a successful farm in Kansas now, has 4 children and a wife who makes the best apple pie in 3 counties. We write letters sometimes." "I'm glad," Lillian said, and meant it. In a story filled with violence and hard choices, it was good to know that sometimes the efforts to save someone actually worked. They talked through the morning as the sun climbed higher and the day grew warm. Silas told her about his ranch, about the cattle business and the challenges of working land that could be generous one year and cruel the next. Lillian found herself sharing stories about her students, about the small victories and daily struggles of teaching children who would grow up harder than they should have to. It was comfortable in a way she hadn't expected, this easy conversation with a man she was only beginning to know. There were silences, but they weren't awkward. They were the comfortable quiet of 2 people who didn't feel the need to fill every moment with words. When the church bells in town began to ring, marking the noon hour, Silas reluctantly pushed back from the table. "I should let you get on with your day," he said, "but I was wondering, would you consider taking a ride with me this afternoon? There's something I'd like to show you." "A ride?" Lillian looked down at her simple dress, then toward the blue ribbon that still lay on her dresser. "I'm not sure I'm properly dressed for—" "You look perfect," Silas said, and there was such sincerity in his voice that she believed him. "It's not far, and I promise to have you back before sunset." An hour later, Lillian found herself seated on the gentle mare Silas had brought for her, the blue ribbon finally in her hair where it belonged. She felt strange wearing color again, almost guilty, but when she'd seen herself in the mirror, hair soft around her face, the ribbon bright against the brown curls, she'd looked like someone who remembered how to hope. Silas rode beside her on his own horse, a large bay gelding that seemed as calm and steady as its owner. He led her away from town, into the rolling hills that stretched toward the mountains, following paths that seemed to exist only in his memory. "Where are we going?" she asked, as they climbed a ridge that offered a spectacular view of the valley below. "You'll see," he said, but there was a smile playing at the corners of his mouth that made her heart skip. They crested a hill and began to descend into a small valley she'd never seen before. It was like stumbling into a secret gardenia meadow, filled with wildflowers, bordered by a clear stream that caught the afternoon sunlight like scattered diamonds. Cottonwood trees provided shade, and the whole place seemed to exist outside the harsh realities of frontier life. "How did you find this place?" Lillian asked, dismounting with Silas's help and looking around in wonder. "My father brought me here when I was about 8 years old," Silas said, his voice soft with memory. "Said every man needed a place where he could think clearly, where the world couldn't reach him. I've been coming here ever since." They walked to the stream's edge, where the water ran clear and cold over smooth stones. Lillian knelt and trailed her fingers in the current, marveling at this hidden oasis in the middle of the rugged country. "It's beautiful," she said, "like something from a dream." "I wanted you to see it," Silas said, settling beside her on the grassy bank. "Wanted you to know that even in hard country, there are places of peace. Places where a person can remember that the world isn't all dust and struggle." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the water and the gentle sound of wind through the cottonwood leaves. Lillian felt something loosening in her chest, some knot of tension that had been there so long. She'd forgotten it wasn't supposed to be part of her. "Silas," she said finally, "those men yesterday, they're really going to come back, aren't they?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Johnson's the type who can't let things go. He'll be back, and when he comes, he'll bring more men." "Maybe I should leave Red Hollow," she said quietly. "If I'm gone, they'll have no reason to—" "No." The word came out with such force that it startled her. "No, Lillian. Running won't solve anything. Men like Johnson, they don't forget or forgive. If you run now, you'll be running for the rest of your life." "Then what do we do?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, staring across the peaceful meadow with eyes that saw too much. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard experience. "We make our stand," he said, "together, because that's what people do when they find something worth fighting for." The simple declaration sent warmth flooding through Lillian's chest. She looked at this man beside her, scarred, dangerous, haunted by a violent past, and realized that she trusted him completely. More than that, she was beginning to care for him in ways that both thrilled and terrified her. "Is that what I am?" she asked softly. "Something worth fighting for?" Silas turned to look at her, and what she saw in his storm-grey eyes took her breath away. "Lillian Grace," he said, "you're worth fighting the whole damn world for." Before she could respond, he leaned closer, moving slowly enough that she could have pulled away if she'd wanted to, but she didn't want to. She wanted to know what it felt like to be kissed by a man who saw her as precious, who thought she was worth defending against any threat. His lips were gentle against hers, careful and questioning, and she found herself answering with a softness she'd almost forgotten she possessed. The kiss lasted only a moment, but when they separated, Lillian felt as though something fundamental had shifted in her world. "I haven't," she began, then stopped, color rising in her cheeks. "Neither have I," Silas said softly. "Not like this, not with someone who matters." As the afternoon wore on, they talked about everything and nothing: childhood memories, dreams for the future, the small details that make up a life. Lillian found herself laughing for the first time in months, really laughing, at Silas's dry observations about town life and his stories about the challenges of ranch work. When the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, they reluctantly prepared to leave their hidden sanctuary. But as Silas helped her mount her horse, Lillian realized that something had changed during their afternoon together. She was no longer just a lonely widow trying to survive in an unwelcoming town. She was a woman who was learning to love again, who had found someone willing to fight for her happiness. The blue ribbon in her hair caught the last rays of sunlight, and for the first time since Thomas's death, Lillian felt truly alive. The brass compass had belonged to Thomas, a wedding gift from his father that he'd carried through their brief marriage and into the war that claimed his life. Now it sat heavy in Lillian's palm as she stood outside the Red Hollow Community Church, watching the congregation filter out after Sunday service with their careful glances and whispered conversations. The compass needle pointed steadily north, unwavering despite the trembling of her hands. It had always fascinated her, this small instrument that always knew true direction, no matter how lost its bearer might be. Thomas used to say it was like faith and inner certainty that guided you even when the path ahead was unclear. She needed that certainty now, because everything in her life seemed to be shifting like sand in a windstorm. Miss Grace, Mayor Cartwright approached with his wife Eleanor at his side, both wearing the expressions of people about to deliver unwelcome news. "Might we have a word?" Lillian tucked the compass into her reticule and straightened her shoulders. The blue ribbon in her hair felt like a small act of defiance, a declaration that she was no longer content to disappear into the grey anonymity of perpetual mourning. "Of course, Mayor Cartwright. It's about your association with Silas Wade," Eleanor said, her voice pitched just loud enough for nearby congregants to overhear. "People are talking, Lillian. They're concerned." "Concerned about what?" "About the appropriateness of a school teacher keeping company with a man of his reputation," the mayor said, his tone apologetic but firm. "You must understand, the children's parents expect their teacher to be above reproach." Lillian felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Mr. Wade has been nothing but respectful and kind to me. I fail to see how accepting his courtship could be considered inappropriate." "Courtship?" Eleanor's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "My dear girl, surely you don't mean to suggest—" "I mean to suggest that I'm a grown woman capable of making my own decisions about my personal life," Lillian said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "Mr. Wade is a respected rancher and a war veteran. If the parents of my students have concerns about my character based on my choice of companions, perhaps they should examine their own prejudices." The mayor and his wife exchanged glances that spoke volumes. "Lillian," Mayor Cartwright said carefully, "I'm afraid it's not quite that simple. The school board has asked me to speak with you about maintaining appropriate standards." "Are you threatening my position?" "We're asking you to consider the welfare of the community," Eleanor said. "Silas Wade is a dangerous man, dear. There are stories." "There are always stories," Lillian interrupted. "Most of them told by people who have never exchanged more than a greeting with the man they're so eager to condemn." But even as she defended Silas, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered doubts. The ease with which he'd faced down those three men, the casual way he'd spoken of killing, the scar that marked his face like a badge of violence, was she being naive to trust him so completely? "Miss Grace," a new voice interrupted her troubled thoughts. Dr. Hayes approached with his familiar gentle smile, though she noticed he glanced warily at the mayor and his wife. "I wondered if I might walk you home. I have some books I thought you might enjoy." Grateful for the rescue, Lillian accepted his offer and allowed him to escort her away from the church steps and the weight of disapproving stares. They walked in comfortable silence until they were well away from the congregation. "Thank you," she said finally. "That was becoming rather uncomfortable." "The Cartwrights mean well," Dr. Hayes said diplomatically, "but they sometimes confuse social conformity with moral righteousness." "Dr. Hayes, may I ask you something? You've lived in Red Hollow longer than most. What do you know about Silas Wade's reputation?" The doctor was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I know that he served his country with distinction during the war. I know that he's never failed to pay his debts or honor his word. I also know that when the Henderson family was struck by fever 3 winters ago, he rode through a blizzard to fetch me and then stayed to help nurse them back to health. But I also know that he's killed men, Lillian. More than most, probably more than he cares to remember. The question isn't whether he's dangerous is. The question is whether he's dangerous to you. And what do you think?" Dr. Hayes stopped walking and turned to face her. "I think that man would burn down half the territory before he'd let anyone hurt you. The question is whether you're prepared for what that kind of devotion might cost." That evening, as Lillian sat in her cabin trying to concentrate on lesson plans, she found her thoughts returning again and again to the doctor's words. The brass compass lay open on her table, its needle pointing steadily north, while she felt increasingly uncertain about her own direction. A soft knock at her door made her look up. Through the window, she could see Silas's familiar silhouette, hat in hand as always when he came calling. But something in his posture seemed different, tenser, more alert. "Evening, Lillian," he said when she opened the door. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Never," she said, stepping aside to let him in, "though you seem troubled about something." Silas settled into the chair across from her small table, his large frame making the furniture look delicate by comparison. "I rode into town today to pick up supplies. Heard some interesting conversation at Morrison's store. About us, I assume. About you, mostly. Seems the good people of Red Hollow have decided I'm a corrupting influence on their schoolteacher." Lillian sighed, closing the brass compass with a soft click. "Mayor Cartwright spoke to me after church. The school board is concerned about my reputation." "Are you having second thoughts?" Silas asked, and she heard something vulnerable beneath the carefully neutral tone. "I don't know," she admitted. "I came here to build a new life, to find peace and purpose. I never intended to become the subject of town gossip or to put my position at risk." "And you never intended to get involved with a man who brings trouble with him wherever he goes." The pain in his voice made her look up sharply. In the lamplight, his scarred face looked haggard, as though he'd been wrestling with demons she couldn't see. "Silas, maybe they're right, Lillian. Maybe you'd be better off without me." "Don't you dare," she said, surprising them both with the force of her response. "Don't you dare make that decision for me." She stood and moved to where he sat, placing her hands on his shoulders and feeling the tension coiled there like a spring wound too tight. "Do you think I'm some fragile flower who can't handle a little gossip?" she asked. "Do you think I'm so weak that I'll crumble at the first sign of disapproval?" "I think you're the strongest woman I've ever known," Silas said quietly, "but I also think you deserve better than what I can give you." "What you can give me," Lillian said, "is the first happiness I've felt in 2 years. What you can give me is someone who sees me as more than just a convenient teacher or a proper widow or a cautionary tale. You make me feel alive again, Silas. Don't take that away from me because other people are afraid of what they don't understand." Silas reached up and covered her hands with his own. "Those men Johnson and his crew, they're still out there. Word is they've been asking questions, gathering information. This isn't over, Lillian, and it's going to get worse before it gets better." "Then we'll face it together," she said simply. "That's what people do when they care about each other, isn't it? They stand together against whatever comes." "You don't understand what you're saying. These aren't church ladies gossiping over tea. These are killers, and they won't hesitate to hurt you to get to me. And you won't hesitate to protect me," Lillian said. "I've seen you, Silas. I've seen the way you watch over me, the way you position yourself between me and any threat. You think I don't notice, but I do." Silas was quiet for a long moment, his storm-grey eyes searching her face as if trying to read her very soul. "This could cost you everything, your job, your place in the community, maybe even your life. And staying away from you could cost me my chance at happiness," Lillian replied. "I've already lost one love to circumstances beyond my control. I won't lose another to fear." She pulled the brass compass from her pocket and placed it on the table between them. "This belonged to my husband. It always points north, no matter where you are or how lost you might feel. And you're my north now, Silas Wade. You're the direction I want to go, the path I want to follow. If that means facing down gossips and killers and anyone else who thinks they have a say in my happiness, then so be it." Silas stared at the compass for a long moment, then looked up at her with an expression that took her breath away. There was wonder there, and gratitude, and something deeper that made her heart race. "You're sure about this?" he asked. "About us? Because once we commit to this path, there's no going back. The people who oppose us will only get more determined, and Johnson—" "Let them come," Lillian said, and meant it. "All of them. I've spent 2 years trying to disappear, trying to make myself small enough that life couldn't hurt me anymore. I'm tired of hiding, Silas. I'm ready to fight for something that matters. Silas stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her close enough that she could feel his heartbeat against her cheek. Then we fight, he said quietly, together. As she stood there in the circle of his arms, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart and feeling safer than she had in years, Lillian realized that the compass on the table was right. She had found her true north at last, and no amount of opposition was going to make her change course now. The faded photograph trembled in Silas's hands as he sat across from Lillian in her small cabin, the weight of memory heavy in the lamplight between them. 5 young men in Union blue smiled back from the cracked sepia image, their faces unmarked by the horrors they would soon witness, their eyes bright with the confidence of boys who still believed in glory and righteous causes. "That's me," Silas said, pointing to the tall figure in the center, "and those were my brothers, not by blood, but by choice and circumstance." Lillian leaned closer, studying the photograph with gentle attention. The young Silas looked so different, no scar marking his jaw, no grey threading his hair, no weight of terrible knowledge in his eyes. He looked like what he had been, a 20-year-old farmer's son who thought he understood what war meant. "They're all dead," he said quietly, "every one of them except me." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin windows and carrying with it the scent of distant rain. Lillian reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, not speaking, just offering the comfort of human touch. "We called ourselves the Devil's Own," Silas continued, his voice thick with old grief. "Started as a joke. We were all from small towns, farm boys who'd never been more than 50 miles from home. We thought we were so clever, so invincible." He traced one finger along the edge of the photograph, his touch gentle despite the calluses that marked years of hard work. Jimmy Sullivan, he was going to be a preacher when the war ended. Could quote scripture better than any minister I ever met, but could also drink any man under the table. He died at Fredericksburg, calling for his mother with his guts spilled in the mud. Lillian's grip on his hand tightened, but she remained silent, understanding that this was something he needed to tell, something that had been locked inside him for too long. Charlie Martinez, you see that smile. Never met a person he couldn't charm, or a problem he couldn't solve with humor. Lost his legs to a cannonball at Chancellorsville. Bled out before we could get him to the field hospital. Each name was another weight added to the grief he carried, another ghost that haunted his nights. Lillian began to understand why he lived alone, why he kept the world at arm's length. How did a man carry so much loss and still find the strength to care about anything? David Chen, first Chinese-American I ever met, smartest man in the regiment, could speak 4 languages and calculate artillery trajectories in his head. Took a Confederate bullet through the throat at Gettysburg. Died trying to tell us something important, but we never figured out what. The photograph was growing damp from the moisture on Silas's fingers, but he couldn't seem to put it down. And Thomas Brennan, me best friend, the brother I never had. He saved my life more times than I can count, always watching my back, always there when things went bad. Silas's voice cracked slightly. He took the saber that gave me this scar, threw himself between me and a Confederate cavalry charge because he saw what I didn't, that the man was aiming for my heart, not my face. "Oh, Silas," Lillian whispered, her own eyes filling with tears for men she'd never known, but whose loss had shaped the man she was learning to love. "I held him while he died," Silas said. "Took 3 hours, and he was conscious for most of it. He made me swear on my mother's grave that I'd live for all of them, that I wouldn't waste the life they'd died to preserve." "Is that why you came back here, to honor that promise?" Silas finally looked up from the photograph, his storm-gray eyes haunted by memories that would never fully fade. "I tried. God knows I tried. Built up the ranch, worked the land, told myself I was living a good life. But every morning I woke up knowing that I was here and they weren't, and I couldn't figure out why I deserved to survive when better men didn't." "Survivor's guilt," Lillian said softly. "I understand it more than you might think." "Do you?" Thomas died in a hospital in Virginia while I was safe at home, tending my garden and teaching children. For the longest time, I couldn't understand why he had to die while I got to keep living. It seemed wrong, unfair, like I should have been the one to pay that price. Silas studied her face in the lamplight, seeing something there that he recognized the particular pain of being the one left behind. "How did you make peace with it?" "I'm not sure I have," Lillian admitted. "But I'm learning that maybe the point isn't to make peace with it. Maybe the point is to live well enough that their sacrifice means something." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the sound of wind against the windows and the distant call of a night bird. The photograph lay on the table between them like a bridge, connecting their separate griefs, their shared understanding of loss. "There's something else," Silas said eventually. "Something about Johnson and why he's so determined to settle old scores." Lillian waited, sensing that this was the heart of whatever had been eating at him. "During the war, after Appomattox, some of us stayed on to help with reconstruction. It was ugly work, carpetbaggers and scalawags, former slaves trying to find their place, Southern families who'd lost everything and blamed everyone but themselves." He ran a hand through his hair, disturbing the silver threads that caught the lamplight. "Johnson was a Confederate deserter who'd turned to robbery and murder. He and his gang were terrorizing freed slaves and Union sympathizers throughout Virginia. The army couldn't catch him. He knew the country too well, had too many people helping him. So they sent you. They sent the devil's own, what was left of us anyway, 5 men hunting one of the most dangerous killers in the territory." Silas's jaw tightened. "We tracked him for 3 months. Found his camp in the Blue Ridge Mountains, high up where he thought no one could reach him." "What happened?" "I killed him," Silas said simply. "Shot him dead while he was eating breakfast. No warning, no chance to surrender. Coldest thing I ever did, but he had it coming. The man had murdered entire families, burned out homesteads with children inside. But if he's dead, that wasn't the end of it. Turned out Johnson had a younger brother, Marcus. He was there that morning, saw me put a bullet through his brother's head, swore he'd make me pay someday." Understanding dawned in Lillian's eyes. "The Johnson who threatened us. Is Marcus Johnson trying to settle a blood debt that's 15 years old?" Silas leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking older than his years. "I thought he was dead too. Heard he'd been killed in a range war down in Texas. Apparently, I heard wrong. And now he's here, in Red Hollow. Now he's here, and he knows the one thing that would hurt me more than dying myself." Silas looked directly at her, his expression grave. "He knows about you, Lillian. Knows that if he wants to destroy me, the way to do it is through you." The words sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the wind outside. She thought of the crude threats she'd been receiving, the hostile stares from townspeople, the sense that forces were moving against her that she didn't fully understand. "How many men does he have?" "Last count, maybe 8 or 10. Enough to make things very difficult if they decide to move against us." "Against us," Lillian repeated, noting how naturally the words came. Despite the danger, despite the fear that was beginning to coil in her stomach like a live thing, she felt a fierce satisfaction that he included her in whatever fight was coming. "I could take you away from here," Silas said suddenly. "Tonight, if necessary, we could ride to Denver or San Francisco or anywhere you wanted to go. Start over somewhere he'd never find us. Is that what you want?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the photograph of his dead friends. "What I want is to keep you safe. What I want is to not have to worry every minute of every day that my past is going to destroy the best thing that's ever happened to me. And running would accomplish that. Maybe. For a while. But not forever." "No," he admitted. "Probably not forever." Lillian picked up the brass compass from where it sat beside the photograph, feeling its familiar weight in her palm. The needle pointed steadily north, unwavering despite the tremor in her hands. "My husband used to say that a compass only works if you trust it completely," she said. "If you keep second-guessing the direction it's pointing, you'll never get where you're trying to go." "And where are we trying to go?" "Forward," Lillian said simply. "Together. Not running from the past, but not letting it dictate our future either." She stood and moved around the table to where he sat, placing her hands on his shoulders and feeling the tension coiled there like a spring wound too tight. "Those men in the photograph, your brothers, what would they want for you?" "They'd want me to be happy," Silas said without hesitation. "They'd want me to find someone to love and build something good with whatever time I have left." "Then that's what we do. We build something good, right here in Red Hollow, and we defend it against anyone who tries to take it away." Silas reached up and pulled her down onto his lap, holding her close enough that she could feel his heartbeat against her cheek. "You realize what you're signing up for? This won't be church socials and Sunday picnics. This will be war, Lillian. Ugly, brutal, and final." "I know," she said, "but I also know that some things are worth fighting for, and what we have, what we're building together, that's worth any risk." As she sat there in the circle of his arms, the faded photograph of his fallen comrades, watching them from the table, Lillian felt the last of her doubts fade away. The path ahead would be dangerous, possibly deadly, but it was their path, and she would walk it with him, compass pointing true north, until they reached whatever destination awaited them. The hidden land deed crackled between Lillian's trembling fingers like autumn leaves, its faded ink spelling out a truth that changed everything she thought she knew about her life in Red Hollow. She'd found it tucked inside Thomas's Bible, pressed between the pages of Psalms, like a prayer made manifest in legal language and official seals. Property deed for 640 acres, Section 12, Township 4, North, Range 15 West. She read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "Granted to Thomas Alexander Grace, June 15th, 1862. Silas stood frozen in the doorway of her cabin, his hat still in his hands from his evening visit, his storm-grey eyes fixed on the document that had just rewritten both their histories. "Thomas owned land here?" he asked, though the evidence was literally in black and white before them. 640 acres, that's a full section." "I don't understand," Lillian said, sinking into her chair as the implications began to cascade through her mind. "He never mentioned owning property in Colorado territory. Never said anything about Red Hollow or—" She stopped, staring at the deed with dawning horror. "The silver mine, Section 12 is where they found the silver." The silence that followed was so profound that Lillian could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the cabin windows and carrying with it the scent of approaching storm. "That means," Silas said slowly, "that legally you own the richest silver claim in the territory." "But I don't want it," Lillian said, her voice rising with something approaching panic. "I never knew it existed. Thomas never told me. Why didn't he tell me?" Silas moved to her side, his large hands settling gently on her shoulders. "Maybe he meant to. Maybe he was waiting for the right time, or maybe he knew it would be dangerous," Lillian finished, the pieces clicking together with terrible clarity. "Maybe he knew that owning that much valuable land would make me a target. Which explains why certain people in Red Hollow have been so hostile toward you," Silas said grimly. "They've known all along who you really are." Lillian's mind raced backward through the months since her arrival, re-examining every cold shoulder, every whispered conversation, every carefully neutral greeting in a new and sinister light. Mayor Cartwright's excessive concern about her reputation, Martha Williams's pointed comments about knowing her place, even the school board's sudden interest in her moral character. "They've been trying to drive me away," she said. "All of them. Not because I'm an outsider or because I'm corrupting their children, but because I own something they want. Or something they're already profiting from," Silas said, his voice hard with anger. "If they've been mining your land without permission, they'd be guilty of theft, large-scale theft." Lillian stood and began to pace the small confines of her cabin, the deed still clutched in her hands. But how would they even know about Thomas's ownership? These records should be filed with the territorial government in Denver. "Unless someone had access to them locally," Silas said. "Someone in a position of trust or authority." "Mayor Cartwright," Lillian said immediately. "He handles all the official correspondence between Red Hollow and the territorial government. If anyone would have seen this deed..." A sharp knock at the cabin door cut off her words. They both froze, listening to the sound of boots on the wooden porch and the creak of someone shifting weight from foot to foot. "Miss Grace," the voice was unfamiliar, gravelly with age or drink. "I need to speak with you. It's about your husband's property." Silas's hand moved instinctively to his gun, and he positioned himself between Lillian and the door. "Who's asking?" he called out. "Name's Fletcher, Jake Fletcher. I was Thomas Grace's business partner, and I've got some things to tell his widow that she needs to hear." Lillian and Silas exchanged glances. She'd never heard Thomas mention anyone named Fletcher, but then again, she'd never heard him mention owning land in Colorado territory either. "How do we know you're telling the truth?" Silas demanded. "Because I've got documents that prove it," Fletcher replied. "And because if you don't let me in, the folks who've been mining that silver illegally for the past 2 years are going to make sure neither of you lives to see morning." The blunt threat hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. After a moment's hesitation, Silas opened the door, but kept his hand near his weapon. Jake Fletcher was a small, wiry man in his 60s, with thinning grey hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His clothes were travel-worn but of good quality, and he carried a leather saddlebag that looked heavy with papers. "Mrs. Grace," he said, removing his hat respectfully, "I'm sorry for your loss. Thomas was a good man and a fair partner." "Partner in what?" Lillian asked, still clutching the deed. Fletcher glanced at Silas, then back at her. "In the mineral rights speculation business. We bought up land all through the territory based on geological surveys, hoping to strike it rich when miners came through. Most of our investments were worthless, but Section 12, that was our crown jewel." He opened his saddlebag and withdrew a thick sheaf of documents. "Correspondence between Thomas and me, assay reports, legal agreements. Everything you need to prove your ownership and claim the back royalties you're owed." "Back royalties?" Lillian's voice was faint. "Ma'am, that mine has produced over $200,000 in silver in the past 2 years. According to our agreement with the Territorial Mining Commission, you're entitled to 20% of all extracted value." The numbers were so large that Lillian couldn't fully comprehend them. $40,000 was more money than she'd ever imagined, possessing enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life, or to build whatever future she chose. "But if Thomas and I owned the land," she said, "why didn't anyone contact me when they started mining?" Fletcher's expression grew grim. "Because certain folks in Red Hollow have been covering up your ownership and keeping the profits for themselves. They've been telling the mining company that the land belongs to the town collectively, with Mayor Cartwright acting as the official representative." "That's fraud," Silas said flatly. "Grand theft, more like," Fletcher replied. "And now that Mrs. Grace is here, asking questions and forming attachments," he glanced meaningfully at Silas, "they're getting nervous. Nervous enough to take permanent action." "You mean they want to kill me?" "I mean they've already tried once, through intermediaries. Those threatening letters you've been receiving, the hostility from townspeople, that was all orchestrated to drive you away. When that didn't work, they hired Johnson and his men to make it look like a personal vendetta." The revelation hit Lillian like a physical blow. She'd thought the town's rejection of her was about social propriety or cultural differences. She'd never imagined it was about money, vast amounts of money, that she'd unknowingly owned all along. "Johnson isn't here for revenge," she said slowly. "He's here because someone paid him to get rid of me." "And me," Silas added grimly. "Once they realized I was protecting you, I became a liability too." Fletcher nodded. "The way I hear it, the plan was to make it look like Johnson killed you both in a fit of revenge, then disappear back into Mexico. Clean and simple, with no one left to ask inconvenient questions about mineral rights or missing royalties." "Except you," Lillian said. "Except me, which is why I rode 3 days straight to get here. Thomas made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd look after you. I'm a little late keeping that promise, but I'm here now." Lillian sank back into her chair, overwhelmed by the sudden reshaping of her reality. She wasn't just a lonely widow trying to build a new life. She was a wealthy woman whose very existence threatened a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of Red Hollow's society. "What do we do?" she asked. "We expose them," Fletcher said simply. "All of them. I've got enough evidence to bring down Cartwright and everyone else involved in the theft. But first, we need to make sure you live long enough to see justice done." Johnson and his men are camped about 5 miles north of town, waiting for word from their employers. Word is, they're planning to move tonight. Silas was already reaching for his gun belt. "Then we don't have much time." "Time for what?" Lillian asked. "To make our stand," Silas said, his voice carrying the steel of absolute determination. "To fight for what's ours, and end this thing once and for all." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching hoofbeats reached them through the cabin walls. Many horses, moving fast, heading straight for her isolated valley. "Looks like they've decided not to wait," Fletcher said, checking his own weapon. Lillian stood, the deed still clutched in her hands, and moved to the window. In the distance, she could see the flicker of torches moving through the darkness, Johnson and his men coming to finish what they'd started. But as she watched them approach, Lillian felt something unexpected rising in her chest. Not fear, though that was there too, but anger. Pure, blazing anger at the people who had stolen from her, lied to her, and tried to drive her away from the only home she'd found since Thomas's death. They wanted a fight, she'd give them one. "Silas," she said, turning from the window with fire in her eyes. "Those guns in your saddlebags there, they loaded?" "Yes, but Lillian." "Good," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Because I'm done running, and I'm done being afraid. That's my land they've been stealing from, my money they've been taking, my life they've been trying to destroy." She folded the deed carefully and tucked it into her bodice, next to her heart. "Time to take back what's mine." The twin Colt revolvers lay heavy in Silas's hands as he checked them for the 3rd time in as many minutes, their blue steel gleaming coldly in the lamplight of Lillian's cabin. These weren't the working guns of a rancher or the sporting weapons of a gentleman. These were instruments of war, designed for one purpose only, and that purpose was death. "I haven't carried these since Appomattox," he said quietly, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency over the familiar mechanisms. "Told myself I'd never need them again." Lillian watched him from across the small room, memorizing every detail of this moment, the way his scarred hands handled the weapons with unconscious skill, the grim set of his jaw, the terrible calm that had settled over him like a shroud. This was Silas Wade as he truly was beneath all the careful control, a man shaped by violence, honed by war, and absolutely lethal when protecting what he loved. Outside, the sound of approaching riders grew steadily louder. Fletcher crouched by the window, peering through a gap in the curtains at the flickering torches that moved through the darkness like malevolent stars. 8 men, he reported. Maybe 9. They're spreading out, trying to surround the cabin. "Johnson's no fool," Silas said, sliding the Colts into the holsters he'd strapped around his waist. "He knows I'm dangerous up close. He'll try to flush us out, make us come to him on ground of his choosing." "What about the townspeople?" Lillian asked. "Surely they won't stand by and let armed men attack." "The townspeople are probably hiding behind locked doors, hoping this all blows over without touching them," Fletcher said bitterly. "And the ones who aren't hiding Cartwright and his cronies, they're probably watching from a safe distance, waiting to see if their hired killers can solve their problem for them." Lillian felt a surge of anger at the thought of Mayor Cartwright sitting safely in his comfortable house while men with guns rode through the night to murder her. All those months of trying to fit in, trying to win their approval, and they'd been plotting against her from the very beginning. "There's something you need to know," she said suddenly, reaching into her reticule and withdrawing Thomas's brass compass. "Before this started, before I knew about the land or the money or any of it, I made a choice. I chose you, Silas. I chose us." She pressed the compass into his hands, feeling the warmth of his fingers against hers. "Thomas carried this through the war. It brought him home to me once, maybe. It'll bring you back to me tonight." Silas stared down at the compass, its needle pointing steadily north despite the tremor in his hands. "Lillian, I love you," she said simply. "I should have said it before, but I was afraid. Afraid of being hurt again, afraid of losing someone else I cared about. But sitting here now, watching you prepare to risk your life for mine, I need you to know that." The words hung in the air between them, like a bridge spanning the chasm of all their unspoken fears. Silas looked up from the compass to meet her eyes, and what she saw there took her breath away. Love and determination, and something that looked almost like peace. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Have since the first day I saw you walking into that schoolhouse, with your head held high and your heart on your sleeve. You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever, a reason to believe in tomorrow." Fletcher cleared his throat diplomatically. "I hate to interrupt, but they're getting closer. We need to make some decisions about how we're going to handle this." Silas tucked the compass into his shirt pocket right over his heart and turned his attention back to the tactical situation. "The cabin's defensible, but only for a while. They'll try to burn us out if they can't storm us directly." "There's a root cellar," Lillian said. "Behind the cabin, maybe 20 yards. It's got a good strong door and stone walls." "Too obvious." Silas shook his head. "First place they'll look after they torch the main building." "What about the old mine shaft?" Fletcher suggested. "The played-out claim about half a mile east. It's got multiple entrances and enough twists and turns to confuse anyone who doesn't know the layout." "Also too obvious," Silas said. "Johnson's done his homework. He'll know about any major features in the area." A new sound reached them through the cabin walls, the creak of leather and the soft jingle of spurs as men dismounted and began moving into position on foot. The torches had stopped moving, forming a rough circle around the small valley. "They're in position," Fletcher whispered. "Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it now." Silas was quiet for a moment, his storm-grey eyes distant as he calculated angles and odds and the terrible mathematics of violence. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under pressure. "Fletcher, can you handle a rifle?" "Well enough. There's a Winchester in my saddlebags, and a box of ammunition. I want you to take position by the back window. You'll have a clear field of fire toward the creek. Don't shoot unless you have to, but if anyone tries to circle around behind us, put them down." Fletcher nodded grimly and moved to retrieve the rifle. "What about me?" Lillian asked. Silas turned to look at her, and she saw him struggling with the conflicting desires to protect her and to trust her with her own safety. "Can you shoot?" "Thomas taught me. I'm not fast, but I'm accurate at close range. There's a derringer in my left saddlebag. 2 shots, but they count for a lot if someone gets past me." He paused, his expression softening slightly. "Lillian, I need you to promise me something. If this goes badly, if they get past our defenses, I need you to use that last bullet on yourself rather than let them take you alive." The brutal practicality of the request hit her like a physical blow, but she understood the necessity behind it. Men like Johnson didn't take prisoners, especially not women who represented both valuable information and potential leverage. "I promise," she said, and meant it. "All right then." Silas moved to the front window and peered out at the ring of torches that marked their enemies' positions. "Johnson," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the night air. "I know you're out there. Let's talk." A harsh laugh echoed back from the darkness. "Nothing to talk about, Wade. You know what I want." "I know what you've been paid to want," Silas replied. "Question is, are you sure your employers are good for the money? Because I've got some interesting information about their financial situation that might change your perspective." There was a pause, long enough for doubt to creep in. Then Johnson's voice came back, harder than before. "Nice try, but I've already been paid. Half up front, half when the job's done." "And what happens when the territorial marshal starts asking questions about 2 dead bodies and a convenient mining accident? You think Cartwright's going to stand by you when the federal government comes calling?" Another pause, longer this time. Lillian could almost hear the wheels turning in Johnson's head as he considered the implications. "You're bluffing," he said finally, but there was less certainty in his voice. Am I? Fletcher, tell the man what you told us about those documents you're carrying. Fletcher moved to the window and raised his voice. I've got sworn affidavits from 3 different mining engineers, Johnson. Plus, correspondence that proves Mayor Cartwright and his friends have been stealing from Mrs. Grace for over 2 years. You kill her now. You're not just murdering a schoolteacher, you're killing the star witness in a federal fraud case. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of wind through the cottonwoods and the distant call of a night bird. Lillian held her breath, hoping against hope that Johnson might be convinced to walk away. Then came the sound she'd been dreading, the metallic click of rifle bolts being worked, the scrape of boots against stone as men took cover behind whatever shelter they could find. Sorry, Wade, Johnson called out, and his voice carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. But I've got a reputation to maintain. Can't have people thinking I'm the kind of man who walks away from a job just because it gets complicated. Then I guess we do this the hard way, Silas replied, and Lillian heard the cold acceptance in his voice, the sound of a man preparing to kill or die. She moved to his side, the small derringer heavy in her hand, and looked out at the ring of torches that marked the positions of men who wanted her dead. In a few minutes, this peaceful valley would become a battlefield, and the quiet life she'd tried to build in Red Hollow would end in gunfire and blood. But as she stood there beside the man she loved, feeling his solid presence and unshakable determination, Lillian realized she wasn't afraid anymore. She was angry, blazingly, righteously angry at the greed and corruption that had brought them to this moment. Silas, she said quietly, when this is over, when we've won, what then? He looked down at her, his scarred face softening with something that might have been hope. Then we build something better. Together. On land that's rightfully yours, with money that's rightfully yours, in a town that learns to respect what we've accomplished. And if we don't win, then we'll have died fighting for something that mattered, he said simply, and that's more than most people can say. The first gunshot shattered the night air like breaking glass, and the battle for Lillian's future began in earnest. The wedding ring slipped from Lillian's finger with surprising ease, as if it too understood that this moment marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. She knelt beside her small garden, the rich earth soft beneath her knees, and pressed the simple gold band into the soil where she'd planted the roses Thomas had loved so much. "Goodbye, my dear heart," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks as gunfire erupted around the cabin. "Thank you for bringing me here, for giving me a chance at happiness again." The ring disappeared beneath the earth like a seed planted for a future harvest, and Lillian felt something that had been clenched tight in her chest for 2 long years finally release. She was no longer Thomas Grace's widow, defined by loss and mourning. She was Lillian, a woman capable of love and fury and fierce determination in equal measure. A bullet shattered the window above her head, sending glass cascading down like deadly rain. She rolled away from the exposed position and crawled back toward the cabin, where Silas was returning fire with methodical precision. "Lillian," his voice cut through the chaos as she slipped through the back door. "Are you hurt?" "No," she gasped, brushing dirt and glass from her dress. "But they're moving closer. I saw at least 3 men working their way around the creek bed." Fletcher's rifle cracked from his position by the rear window, followed immediately by a cry of pain from outside. "Got one," he called grimly. "But there's more coming." Silas appeared at her side, his storm-grey eyes bright with the terrible clarity that comes with mortal combat. "They're trying to rush us," he said. "Johnson's getting impatient, probably figures he can overwhelm us with numbers before we can make them pay too high a price." "Is he right?" "Depends on how much fight we've got in us," Silas replied, then smiled a hard, predatory expression that reminded her just how dangerous this gentleman could be. "And I've got plenty of fight left." The front door exploded inward as 2 of Johnson's men charged through, their guns blazing. Silas moved with fluid grace, his twin Colts appearing in his hands as if by magic. The first attacker dropped before he'd taken 3 steps, Silas's bullet taking him center mass. The second man got off one wild shot before the other Colt spoke, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the cabin wall. In the sudden silence that followed, Lillian could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears and smell the acrid tang of gunpowder that now filled the small space. "That's two down," Fletcher called from his position. "But they'll try again. Johnson's not the type to give up easy." As if summoned by his words, Johnson's voice cut through the night air. "Wade, you're just delaying the inevitable. Send out the woman and we'll make it quick for both of you." "Counter, offer," Silas shouted back, ejecting the spent shells from his revolvers and reloading with practice speed. "You and your boys ride out now, and maybe some of you live to see sunrise." Johnson's laugh was ugly. Big talk from a man who's trapped in a cabin with nowhere to run. "Who says I'm running?" Silas replied, and Lillian heard something in his voice that made her blood run cold. "Maybe it's time to take this fight to you." "Silas, no," she said, grabbing his arm. "There are too many of them, and they're expecting us to hunker down and wait for them to pick us apart," he said. "Sometimes the best defense is a good offense." He moved to the shattered front door and peered out at the positions marked by muzzle flashes and moving shadows. "Fletcher, can you keep them busy from here?" "For a while," the older man replied. "What are you planning?" "Something stupid," Silas admitted, "but sometimes stupid works when smart doesn't." Before Lillian could protest, he was moving not toward the door as she'd expected, but toward the back wall of the cabin. With two powerful kicks, he broke through the thin boards and disappeared into the night beyond. For a terrifying moment, Lillian was alone with Fletcher and the bodies of the dead men, listening to the gunfire outside and wondering if she would ever see Silas alive again. Then she heard something that made her heart soar, distinctive crack of his Colts firing in rapid succession, followed by screams of surprise and pain from Johnson's men. "He's behind them," Fletcher said with something approaching admiration. "Son of a bitch actually circled around and got behind their line." The battle outside intensified as Johnson's carefully planned ambush dissolved into chaos. Men who had been confidently closing in on a trapped target suddenly found themselves caught between Fletcher's rifle fire from the cabin and Silas's deadly accurate pistols from their rear. Lillian crept to the broken window and peered out, trying to spot Silas in the confusion of moving shadows and muzzle flashes. She caught a glimpse of him rolling behind a fallen log, his Colt spitting fire as he engaged two men who were trying to flank his position. One of the attackers managed to get close enough to rush him, but Silas seemed to sense the threat without looking. He spun and fired in one fluid motion, dropping the man before he could cover half the distance between them. "That's how you do it, boy," Fletcher whooped from his position, "just like the old days." But even as Lillian felt a surge of hope, she could see that the odds were still against them. Silas was magnificent warrior in his element, deadly and precise, but he was still outnumbered. And Johnson was smart enough to realize that his advantage lay in forcing a prolonged engagement rather than trying to match Silas shot for shot. "Wade," Johnson's voice carried clearly across the battlefield. "You're good, I'll give you that. But you can't be everywhere at once." Even as he spoke, Lillian saw movement near the cabin's side, two men creeping through the shadows with obvious intent to breach their refuge, while Silas was occupied elsewhere. Without thinking, she grabbed the derringer from where she'd placed it on the table and moved toward the cabin's side window. The two men were almost at the wall now, close enough that she could see their faces in the flickering light from the scattered torches. She recognized one of them, Pete Morrison, the man who ran the general store and had always been polite to her face while apparently plotting her murder behind her back. The betrayal cut deep, but it also steeled her resolve. When Morrison reached for the window latch, Lillian was waiting for him. She pressed the derringer's barrel against the glass and pulled the trigger, the small gun's report muffled by the intervening window, but no less effective for that. Morrison dropped without a sound, his companion spinning toward the unexpected threat. Lillian fired her second and final shot, watching the man stagger backward with a cry of pain and rage. He wasn't dead, she could see him moving, trying to bring his rifle to bear, but the derringer was empty, and she had no other weapons within reach. Time seemed to slow as she watched the wounded man struggle to aim his rifle at the window where she stood exposed. This was it. She realized the moment. Thomas's compass had been pointing toward all along. The moment when her choices and her courage would determine whether she lived to build a future with Silas or died defending the love they'd found. The rifle barrel swung toward her with agonizing slowness, and Lillian found herself thinking not of fear or regret, but of the new iron horseshoe she'd noticed hanging over Silas's cabin, Dora, symbol of luck and protection, of homes built to last and love worth defending. She was still thinking of that horseshoe when Silas appeared behind the wounded man like an avenging angel, his Colt pressed against the back of the man's skull. "Drop it," he said quietly, and there was such deadly certainty in his voice that the man obeyed without question. Across the battlefield, the gunfire was beginning to slacken as Johnson's remaining men realized their position was untenable. Caught between multiple defenders and facing an opponent who seemed to anticipate their every move, the hired killers were beginning to lose their nerve. "This isn't over, Wade." Johnson's voice carried a note of frustrated rage. "You hear me? This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Silas called back, his Colts trained on the shadows where Johnson's voice had originated. "It's over, and you lost. The question now is whether you're smart enough to admit it." The silence that followed stretched like a bowstring, filled with the weight of decision and the promise of finality. Then, gradually, Lillian heard the sound she'd been praying for, the creak of leather and the soft thud of boots as men remounted their horses and began to withdraw. They had won. Against all odds, against superior numbers and murderous intent, they had won. The new iron horseshoe gleamed silver in the first light of dawn, half buried in the churned earth beside Lillian's cabin, where it had fallen during the night's violence. She knelt and picked it up, feeling its weight in her palm, solid, real, a symbol of protection and good fortune that had somehow survived the chaos that had transformed her quiet valley into a battlefield. Silas emerged from the cabin behind her, his shirt torn and blood-stained, his face marked with exhaustion but alive with the fierce satisfaction of victory. In his hands he carried the evidence of their triumph, Johnson's abandoned rifle and the saddlebags full of documents that would bring down Mayor Cartwright's conspiracy. "5 dead," he reported quietly. 3 more wounded, but they'll live. Johnson got away, but without most of his men, and with a bullet in his shoulder courtesy of Fletcher's rifle. Will he be back? Not for a long time, if ever. Men like Johnson are opportunists. They fight when the odds favor them and disappear when they don't. Tonight proved we're more trouble than he bargained for. Lillian looked around at the aftermath of their desperate stand. The cabin bore scars that would take time to repair: shattered windows, bullet holes in the walls, the front door hanging askew on its hinges. But they were alive, and more importantly, they were free. "What about the townspeople?" she asked, noting the absence of anyone from Red Hollow, despite the gunfire that must have awakened half the territory. "Waiting to see which way the wind blows," Fletcher said, approaching from where he'd been checking the bodies of their attackers. "They'll come around once they realize you're not just the schoolteacher anymore. You're the woman who owns the richest mine in the county and has the documents to prove half their leaders are thieves." The sun climbed higher, painting the eastern sky in shades of gold and rose, and with it came the sound of approaching riders. But these weren't the furtive movements of assassins. This was the steady advance of legitimate authority. "Territorial Marshal," Fletcher said, squinting at the approaching dust cloud. "I sent word yesterday through the telegraph office in Coyote Springs. Figured we'd need official backing once the shooting started." The marshal turned out to be a weathered man in his 50s named Samuel Hartford, who listened to their story with the patient attention of someone accustomed to sorting truth from fiction in violent situations. He examined Fletcher's documents, interviewed the wounded survivors, and walked the battlefield with the methodical care of a man building a legal case. "This is considerable fraud," he said finally, settling his hat back on his graying head. "Federal fraud, given that we're talking about mineral rights on territorial land." Mayor Cartwright and his associates are looking at significant prison time. And Mrs. Grace's ownership of the mine? Silas asked. Clear and legal, Marshal Hartford replied. She's entitled to immediate possession of the property and compensation for all extracted materials. I'd estimate she's worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $50,000, maybe more. The number was so vast that Lillian could barely comprehend it. $50,000 was enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life, enough to build whatever future she could imagine. But as she looked at Silas, standing tall and proud despite his injuries, she realized that all the money in the world meant nothing compared to what they'd already won. "Marshal," she said, stepping forward with the iron horseshoe still clutched in her hand, "I want to press full charges against everyone involved in this conspiracy. But I also want to make something clear. Red Hollow is my home now, and I intend to stay here. Even after what happened. Especially after what happened. This town needs new leadership, honest leadership. People who understand that prosperity built on theft and murder isn't prosperity at all, it's just delayed destruction." Marshal Hartford nodded approvingly. "That's a fine sentiment, Mrs. Grace. Though you might want to consider changing your name soon, I understand congratulations are in order." Lillian looked at Silas in surprise, then realized that sometime during the long night of violence and revelation, they had both simply assumed their future together. No formal proposal had been made, no pretty speeches about love and devotion, but the commitment was there nonetheless, forged in gunfire and sealed with shared blood. "Is that a proposal, Mr. Wade?" she asked, unable to keep the smile from her voice. Silas dropped to one knee right there in the dirt and chaos of the battlefield, taking her free hand in both of his. "Lillian Grace," he said, his storm-grey eyes bright with love and hope, "I'm claiming you tonight and every night for the rest of our lives. Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said without hesitation, and felt the last piece of her broken heart click into place. "Yes, absolutely yes." The kiss that followed was witnessed by a territorial marshal, a grizzled business partner, and the scattered remnants of their enemies. But Lillian didn't care. She was kissing the man she loved on the land she owned in the town that would learn to respect them both, and the iron horseshoe in her hand seemed to pulse with the promise of good fortune and lasting happiness. When they finally separated, Marshal Hartford was grinning broadly. "Well then," he said, "I suppose we'd better get this mess cleaned up so you two can start planning a wedding." As if summoned by his words, the first of the townspeople began to appear, cautious figures emerging from Red Hollow's streets and approaching the valley where so much had been decided in the space of a few violent hours. Dr. Hayes was among the first, his medical bag in hand and his face creased with concern for their welfare. Behind him came others, some curious, some ashamed, some calculating how this dramatic shift in power and wealth might affect their own fortunes. But Lillian noticed that none of them seemed surprised by what they found. Word had traveled fast, as it always did in small communities, and everyone in Red Hollow now knew that the quiet schoolteacher they'd tried to drive away was actually the richest woman in the territory. "Miss Grace," Dr. Hayes said formally, then caught himself. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Wade, are you injured?" "Bruised and shaken, but whole," she replied, then looked pointedly at the gathering crowd. "Which is more than I can say for some reputations in this town." Several of the townspeople had the grace to look ashamed, but Lillian wasn't interested in retribution. She was interested in building something better from the wreckage of what had come before. "I know some of you were involved in the conspiracy against me," she continued, her voice carrying clearly across the valley. "I know others simply stood by and let it happen, but what's done is done. What matters now is what we do next." She held up the iron horseshoe, letting it catch the morning light. "This town can be a place of honesty and prosperity, or it can continue to be a place where greed and corruption flourish in the shadows. The choice is yours, but understand that I'll be watching, and I'll be holding everyone to the same standards I hold myself to." The crowd was silent, absorbing this declaration from a woman who had proven she was not to be underestimated. Finally, Martha Williams stepped forward, the same woman who had confronted Lillian about knowing her place just days earlier. Mrs. Grace, she said, her voice steady despite the obvious effort it cost her. I owe you an apology. We all do. We let fear and greed make us forget our better natures. Apology accepted, Lillian replied graciously, but it's actions that matter now, not words. One by one, other townspeople came forward to offer their congratulations on her engagement and their support for the changes she wanted to make. Some seemed sincere, others merely pragmatic, but all of them seemed to understand that the balance of power in Red Hollow had shifted permanently. As the crowd began to disperse and the marshal made preparations to transport his prisoners, Silas drew Lillian aside to a quiet spot overlooking the valley that had become their battlefield and their victory ground. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "About staying here, about taking on the responsibility of reforming this town. We could go anywhere now, San Francisco, Denver, even back east if you wanted." Lillian looked out over the land that was now legally hers, at the town that had rejected her and then tried to destroy her, and felt not bitterness but possibility. This was where Thomas's compass had led her, where his hidden legacy had given her the power to build something lasting and good. "This is home," she said simply. "This is where we make our stand, where we prove that love and honesty can triumph over greed and corruption. Besides," she added with a smile, "someone needs to make sure the children of Red Hollow get a proper education. Even after everything that's happened, you still want to teach. Especially after everything that's happened, these children need to learn that standing up for what's right sometimes requires courage, but it's always worth the cost." Silas pulled her close, and they stood together in the growing warmth of the morning sun, planning their future on the foundation of their shared victory. The iron horseshoe in Lillian's hand seemed to grow warm, as if blessed by the promise of good fortune and lasting love that lay ahead. The simple gold band caught the afternoon sunlight as Silas slipped it onto Lillian's finger, his scarred hands gentle despite their tremor of emotion. 6 months had passed since the night that changed everything, and Red Hollow's small church was packed with faces that had once regarded her with suspicion, but now showed respect, gratitude, and genuine affection. "With this ring, I thee wed," Silas said, his storm-grey eyes bright with happiness. "And with my heart, I promise to love and protect you for all the days of our lives." Lillian looked down at the ring knot, ornate or expensive, but perfectly suited to the life they were building together. It was honest gold, worked by honest hands, a symbol of the straightforward love that had grown between them through trials that would have broken weaker bonds. "And I promise to stand beside you," she replied, her voice carrying clearly through the church that had once felt so unwelcoming, "through whatever challenges may come. We've already proven we can weather the worst storms. Together everything else will be a blessing." Reverend Matthews, the new minister who had replaced the previous one after some uncomfortable questions about his involvement with Mayor Cartwright's conspiracy, smiled broadly as he pronounced them husband and wife. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Wade." The kiss was sweet and sure, a promise kept and a future claimed. When they separated, the church erupted in applause and cheers from a congregation that included many of Lillian's former students, now grown into young men and women who remembered the teacher who had believed in their potential, even when others saw only limitations. After the ceremony, as the celebration moved to the town square, where tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by families who had once whispered about the inappropriate schoolteacher, Lillian found a quiet moment to reflect on the changes that had transformed Red Hollow. Mayor Cartwright was serving a 10-year sentence in the territorial prison, along with 3 of his co-conspirators. The mining operation was now run honestly, with proper contracts and fair wages, generating prosperity that benefited the entire community rather than just a corrupt few. The school had been expanded, with 2 teachers now handling the growing number of children whose parents suddenly saw the value of education. Most importantly, Red Hollow had learned to value integrity over expedience, community over conspiracy. It wasn't perfect, no place ever was, but it was honest, and that made all the difference. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Wade," Silas said, appearing at her side with 2 glasses of punch and a smile that still made her heart skip. "Just thinking about how much has changed," she replied, accepting the punch and settling beside him on the bench they'd claimed near the edge of the celebration. "6 months ago, I was the loneliest woman in the territory. Now look at us. Any regrets?" Lillian considered the question seriously, looking out over the faces of their friends and neighbors, the children playing games between the tables, the musicians tuning their instruments for the dancing that would follow. This wasn't the quiet, anonymous life she'd originally sought when she came west. Instead, it was something far better, a life of purpose and connection, of challenges met and victories shared. "Just one," she said finally, reaching into her reticule to withdraw a familiar object. The wooden rose Silas had carved for her during their courtship was more polished now from frequent handling, its details even more intricate than when he'd first pressed it into her palm. She'd carried it with her every day since, a reminder of the moment when a lonely woman and a scarred man had decided to trust each other with their hearts. "I regret that we can't go back and tell our younger selves that everything would work out," she said, "that all the fear and uncertainty and loneliness would lead to this." "Would you, though?" Silas asked thoughtfully. "If we'd known how it would end, would we have fought as hard? Would we have valued what we found as much if we hadn't nearly lost it?" Lillian smiled, recognizing the wisdom in his words. The trials they'd faced together hadn't been obstacles to their happiness. They'd been the forge in which their love had been tested and proven true. "You're right," she said. "The hard times made the good times precious. The fear made the love sweeter. The loneliness made the companionship a gift rather than an expectation." Dr. Hayes approached their quiet corner with his familiar gentle smile, carrying a leather-bound ledger under his arm. "Congratulations again, both of you. The whole town is talking about what a fine ceremony it was." "Thank you, Doctor," Lillian said warmly. "Your friendship has meant more to us than you know. Actually, that's part of why I wanted to speak with you." Dr. Hayes settled onto the bench beside them, opening the ledger to reveal columns of figures and notes written in his careful handwriting. "As the newly elected mayor, still can't believe the voters trusted me with that responsibility. I wanted to give you both an official report on the town's progress. The changes were remarkable. The honest operation of the silver mine had increased tax revenues by 40%. The expanded school was attracting families from neighboring settlements, growing Red Hollow's population and economic base. Most significantly, the town's reputation had transformed from a place of corruption and violence to one of integrity and opportunity. We're even getting inquiries from the territorial capital about hosting the next regional educational conference," Dr. Hayes said proudly. "Seems word has spread about our innovative teaching methods and community involvement in education." Lillian felt a warm glow of satisfaction at this news. The changes she'd implemented went far beyond simple curriculum improvements. She'd insisted that parents be involved in their children's education, that local history and practical skills be taught alongside traditional subjects, and that every child, regardless of their family's economic situation, have access to the same quality of instruction. "There's something else," Dr. Hayes continued, his tone becoming more serious. "We received word yesterday that the territorial governor will be visiting Red Hollow next month. Apparently, he wants to see firsthand how a community can transform itself so completely in such a short time. He wants to study us like specimens," Silas said with amusement. "More likely he wants to replicate our success in other troubled towns," Lillian replied. "Which means we need to make sure our example is worth following." As if summoned by their conversation about the future, little Billy Harmonow, 9 years old, and still one of Lillian's most enthusiastic students, appeared at their table with a hand-picked bouquet of wildflowers. "These are for you, Mrs. Wade," he said shyly. "Ma says married ladies need flowers to make them feel special." Lillian accepted the bouquet with genuine pleasure, remembering the frightened, uncertain woman who had first met this bright-eyed boy in a one-room schoolhouse that felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. "Thank you, Billy. They're beautiful. How are your lessons coming along?" "Real good. And guess what? Pa says if I keep improving my arithmetic, he might let me help with the bookkeeping at the store," says a man needs to understand numbers if he wants to succeed in business. This was perhaps the most remarkable change of all. Parents who had once viewed education with suspicion now actively encouraged their children's learning, seeing it not as a threat to traditional values, but as a tool for building better lives. As Billy ran off to rejoin his friends, Fletcher approached their table with a telegram in his weathered hands. The old prospector had become something of a local celebrity since the night of the gunfight, regaling anyone who would listen with tales of the brave schoolteacher and the deadly rancher who had faced down an army of killers. "This just came in from Denver," he said, handing the telegram to Lillian. "Looks like official business." Lillian unfolded the paper and read its contents aloud. "Mrs. Lillian Wade, Red Hollow, Colorado Territory. Stop. Territorial Education Department requests your consideration for appointment as Regional Superintendent of Schools. Stop. Salary commensurate with experience and demonstrated success. Stop. Please reply at earliest convenience. Stop. Signed, Commissioner James Mitchell." The offer was extraordinary, a position of real authority and influence. The chance to spread the educational innovations they'd developed in Red Hollow to schools throughout the territory. It represented everything she'd once dreamed of achieving. "Well?" Silas asked quietly. "What do you think?" Lillian looked around at the celebration continuing in the town square, at the faces of children and adults who had become not just her community but her family. She thought of the classroom where she'd first begun to heal from Thomas's death, of the cabin where she'd learned to love again, of the land that had given her both wealth and purpose. "I think," she said finally, "that Red Hollow still needs its schoolteacher. And I think the best way to influence education in the territory is to keep proving that our methods work right here, where everyone can see the results." She folded the telegram and tucked it into her reticule next to the wooden rose. "Besides, we have a ranch to run and a community to nurture. I can't think of any work more important than that." Silas's smile was radiant with pride and love. "Are you sure? This is a significant opportunity." "I'm sure," Lillian said, taking his hand and feeling the solid warmth of the gold band that now matched her own. "Sometimes the most important work happens in small places, with small acts of courage and love. That's what Thomas's compass was pointing toward all along, not to some grand destiny, but to home." As the afternoon wore on and the celebration moved into evening, couples began to form for the traditional wedding dance. Silas stood and offered Lillian his hand with the same courtly grace he'd shown since their first meeting. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Wade?" "Always," she replied, allowing him to lead her onto the makeshift dance floor as the musicians struck up a gentle waltz. They moved together with the easy confidence of two people who had learned to trust each other completely. Their steps perfectly matched, despite the disparity in their heights. Around them, other couples joined the dance. Dr. Hayes with the new schoolteacher he'd been courting, Fletcher with Martha Williams, young couples and old ones, all celebrating not just this wedding, but the transformation of their entire community. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stepped into that classroom that first night?" Lillian asked as they swayed to the music. "Every day," Silas admitted. "But then I remember that some things are meant to be. Your husband's land deed, Johnson's revenge, even the town's corruption, it all led us to each other." "Thomas would have liked you," Lillian said with certainty. "He would have appreciated your honor and your courage. And he would have been proud of what you've accomplished here. You didn't just survive your grief, you transformed it into something that benefits everyone around you." As the music played and the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Lillian reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had indeed been broken when she arrived in Red Hollow, carrying her loneliness like a stone in her chest. But brokenness, she had learned, was not the same as destruction. Sometimes things needed to be broken before they could be rebuilt into something stronger and more beautiful. The wooden rose in her reticule, the gold band on her finger, the iron horseshoe hanging over their cabin door, all symbols of the life they had built together from the fragments of their separate sorrows. And tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that love and integrity could triumph over any obstacle. But tonight, As she danced with her husband under the stars in a town that had learned to love them both, Lillian felt complete in a way she had never expected to feel again. Sometimes life breaks us so completely that we forget what it feels like to be whole again. But sometimes, if we're very fortunate and very brave, we discover that being broken was just the first step toward becoming something even better than we were before. The compass of her heart pointed steadily toward home, toward love, toward the future they would build together one day at a time. And that, she realized, was exactly where it was supposed to point.